Do you struggle with matching up center points accurately in English paper piecing? Keep watching because in this video, I'm giving you 9 tips to help you achieve better accuracy. If you're returning, welcome back. And if you're new here, hello and welcome to the MakerJayne channel, where I share all things English paper piecing, from tips and tutorials to projects and more. So if you love EPP like I do, please consider subscribing. This month, inside of Blossom, my EPP membership, we worked on a hexagon block that has 12 sharp points that all come together in the center of the block. Now, matching up points that come together in a central area like this accurately can be one of the most difficult things to achieve in EPP. And so as we were working on this block, I thought it would be a good idea to go ahead and make a video and share it with you here, sharing my tips to help you achieve better accuracy when you're lining up and trying to match up any number of points that come together in the center of a motif. In this particular example, I have 12 points coming together, but these same tips will apply if you have just 3 or 4 or 6, any number of points or corners of a shape that come together in one central area. These tips are going to apply to. As we go through these tips today, I'm going to be making a block similar to this, same pattern, different fabrics, to help demonstrate some of the concepts that I share with you. Watch until the end, because at the end of the video, I'm going to be sharing a bonus tip for you beyond just the 9. And I'm also going to be telling you a little bit more about Blossom and how you can become part of our amazing English paper piecing community and grow your EPP skills with us. So let's go ahead and dive in with tip number 1. Take your time. Now, when it comes to English paper piecing, those of us who love the process already know that it's a slower paced, more quiet process. And we value that and we enjoy that. But sometimes we can get into kind of a zone where we are just maybe going through the motions or kind of on autopilot with our process. And we might tend to get in a hurry. I know that I am guilty of this, especially when I'm basting, because I really want to get to the stitching part of the process. But it's important, no matter what part of the process we're in, to remember to take our time. And so that's tip number 1. Just as you approach any EPP project, but especially a motif or block in which you've got some center points that are coming together that you really want to achieve some accuracy and you want to match those points up accurately, you want to just try to remember to slow down and to take your time. That's really going to help relieve stress. It's going to help relieve any tension and frustration. And it's going to make the process a little bit more pleasant of a process. Because when it comes to matching up points, especially when we're working with this many points, there is going to be a little bit of a tension and there is going to be a little bit of frustration just because of the nature of what we have going on the back. We've got a lot of fabric coming together right here in the center. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible. And so these tips are here to help you basically achieve the results that you want to achieve, while at the same time reducing some of that stress or frustration that you might be experiencing. So take your time as you approach these types of EPP motifs. Okay, for the rest of our tips, we're going to head over to the work table as I demonstrate on same block, different fabrics. The second tip I have for you is baste your shapes consistently. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you're working with multiples of the same shape, like I have here in this example, all of these are the same triangle, even though they're basted with different fabrics. And when I say baste your shapes consistently, when you're working with multiples of the same shape, you want to baste each of those shapes in the same exact way. So you can see no matter which piece it is, and no matter what fabric I'm using, they are all basted in the same orientation. So there's consistency here. The direction of your tails isn't quite as important as the consistency. So if you baste one that has a tail pointing in this direction, then you want to try to baste the rest of your shapes in that same way. The reason for this is as we start bringing all these points together, when they're basted consistently, those seam allowances are going to nest very nicely underneath each other. We'll put these two together. This is how it goes in the particular pattern that I'm working on. And when I get ready to add the next shape next to that, you can see these tails that are all coming together at the end, at the bottom. They're all nesting over each other very cleanly and very consistently. So they're all pointing in the same direction. And what that's going to allow is that's going to enable you to get your seam allowances to do a nice spiral and lay nice and flat on the back, which in the long run is going to help you as you're stitching get more consistent points and get your points to match up more accurately. Tip number 3 is to line up your points when you're stitching your pieces together. So for this particular motif, I am putting 2 triangles back to back together to make a diamond shape. And when we are joining 2 pieces together, this is no matter what type of shape you're working with, but when you're joining 2 pieces together, you want to make sure that you're lining up your ends, your end points with the corresponding shape so that your shapes aren't, skewed this way at all. The more accurate you are in lining up your points when you're piecing just the 2 pieces together, the better off you'll be when you get to the point where you want to get all of those points to come together as well. Because the accuracy that you achieved here is going to pay off for you when you get to that future step. So one way that I do this is to actually use some clips, or sew tights is another option. And that's actually tip number 4 that I have for you, is to use some sort of clip or sew tights, if that's what you prefer, to hold your pieces for you once you get them lined up. So for this particular shape, I am not only looking at the ends to make sure that they're lined up, and to do that, I just simply fold back the seam allowance slightly, this little tail, so that I can see the actual point of my triangle. And those are looking pretty good. Those are lined up pretty well. And then I'm just kind of doing the same thing, just visually identifying where the 2 points are and making sure they're matching up. The third thing that I check is if it's the same shape, right? They're 2 of the identical shapes. I also make sure that the other edges of that shape are also lined up as well, kind of a third check. And then once I've got everything lined up, then I grab my clip so that it holds them nice and securely in place. So that's always a great thing that you can try out if you're having issues holding your pieces and maybe you find that your pieces are shifting. Using clips or sew tight can be very helpful. Once you've got your pieces lined up and secured in place, if you decide to use some sort of tool like this, the 5th tip that I have for you is to stitch your pieces together as accurately as possible. That's pretty obvious, right? We want to try to stitch as accurately as possible. But when we're working with points, especially points that are as sharp as these points here, you really want to begin and end your seam as accurately as possible. And what I mean by that is you want to make sure that you're actually stitching or beginning your stitches, especially right at the point. You don't want to start your stitches too far into that seam, and you also don't want to start your stitches out here in your fabric tails, because that's really not part of the seam. And if you catch your tails as you're starting your seam, that's going to create some inaccuracy later on when you're trying to get all of your points to match up. So let me show you what I like to do to try to stitch as accurately as possible. I've got my needle threaded up, and I'm going to go ahead and start this seam. And I bury my tail. I do this all the time just to keep the thread out of my way as I'm stitching. This is totally optional, but I do find that it's helpful. And what I do is I fold my tails out of the way, and I want to locate basically the point at which the paper template ends and the fabric folds over that point. Being careful to not fold the paper as I'm moving my tails out of the way. If you're using cardstock, this isn't necessarily that big of an issue, but if you're using paper like regular printer paper, you're going to have to take a little bit of extra caution as you're folding your tails out of the way because you don't want to distort the paper template inside. The whole point of the paper template is to help hold the actual shape that you want to stitch. And if you accidentally fold or bend your paper, then it's no longer going to create an accurate shape. So now that my tails are folded out of the way, I kind of maneuver my pieces a little bit just so that I can visually identify where that point is. And so you can see there's an angle here that is along the fabric tails, and then there's a different angle that's along the edge of my actual paper template. And right where that angle turns, which is right about here, that's where the point of my triangle is. And so that is the location that I'm going to try to start my initial stitches. So you want to try to locate where that point is on your pieces. And once you locate that point, then you can go ahead and start your stitches. The more accurate you are in locating and beginning your stitches right where that point is, the better off you'll be in the long run, because that accuracy at this point will pay off when you get to the place of joining all of your points together and trying to get them to match up. So I'll continue down the seam, and when I get to the end of the seam, I will talk you through the accuracy of stitching that end of the seam as well. Okay, I'm coming up on the end of the seam. I went ahead and removed my clip because it was in my way. So I went ahead and took that off. I peeled the seam allowance of my top piece here out of the way because I don't want to catch any of my seam allowance or my tails in my stitching. That's important because if you do accidentally catch your seam allowances or your tails, you're going to be fighting with those later on. So try to keep your seam allowances out of your way, both at the beginning of your seam and the end of your seam, which is what we're looking at right here. So I've just got a few more stitches to take. And before I start taking those, I just want to point out a couple of things. When we get to the end of our seam, we want to, again, try to locate the points of our actual shape. And so again, before you finish off that seam, you want to locate those points, and you can do that just like we did at the beginning by kind of folding or, gently pressing your seam allowance tails out of your way. And I just kind of, gently push them back with my finger. I am using cardstock, so when I do this, my cardstock templates are not being folded or distorted in any way. Again, if you're using regular paper, just take extra care if you want to try this technique. So you can see as I fold those thread tails out of the way, you can see the tips of my pieces right there. That is where my cardstock paper templates are really poking right up against the fabric. And so that is the point at which I want to finish my stitches. And once you identify where that point is, you just want to kind of keep a mental note of that, a visual note of it as you start approaching that area. And you can always, you know, take a pause and reassess, make sure that the points are where you think they are. So I've got pretty much one more stitch is going to get me to that place. So I'm going to go ahead and take that stitch. And as you take this last set of stitches right where that point is, part of this stitching the seam accurately, we're still talking about tip number 5, is to only pick up just enough fabric that you need. You don't want to pick up too much fabric at these points. The more fabric you pick up, the more blunt your points will tend to be. So try to pick up just a few, maybe 2 or 3 threads from each fabric, each EPP piece that you're working with, and no more. And then just take several stitches in place to help secure that thread, to help secure your stitches. And then I always like to finish off with a knot before I bury my thread. And this accuracy, as you're just sewing your 2 pieces together, is really going to help you later on when you start adding more and more of these pieces into a center motif. For tip number 6, what I recommend is to work your central motif in half sections. Once you've got the 2 halves created, then you can join those 2 halves together. So let me show you what I mean by this. So the pieces that I have been working on, I went ahead and created the 2 halves of the central star of this block. And when you put the 2 halves together, that's when you're going to get your central motif. In this case, this 6-pointed star. So for tip number 6, the key is to actually make your halves and to only focus on the central motif. We're not making the entire half of the block or whatever it is you might be working on. In this case, it's the block. We're only focusing on what are the exact shapes that make up this central area that we're trying to match up. By adding in these extra pieces early on, we're actually creating more things that we have to focus on and more things that we have to think about that actually, I find, can draw our attention away from the real task at hand, which should be this central area. So that's why I recommend to only create the central motif, get the center lined up for that motif, and then we can come in and add in the bits and bobs around the outside. There are a couple of different ways that you can approach this. One is that you could start at one end and work your way all the way down to the other end. And I've done that before and it's worked out rather nicely. I actually used that method for this particular block. And I think my points were able to get matched up pretty nicely. I'm very satisfied and very happy with the results of this block. Another way that I have used personally, and I've heard other stitchers use, is to actually start in the center of the motif, right where all these seam allowances are coming together, because you know that that's where you want everything to line up, right? So it makes sense that that would be the best place to start, because you can get everything lined up initially and then work your way out in one direction and then cut your thread and come back to the center and work your way out in the other direction. So tip number 7 would be to try starting in the center. If you have tried stitching a motif like a star or some other motif where you've got your points coming together in the center, and in the past you have stitched from one end all the way across to the other end, and you have found that your pieces just aren't lining up, maybe something shifts and your points are off, whatever it may be, you may want to consider trying tip number 7 in which you would actually instead start stitching in the center. Tip number 8 is don't be afraid and don't hesitate to fold your seam allowances out of your way. I know that as we get into this center area where we have multiple seam allowances coming together, that it can feel intimidating and it can kind of be one of the lesser favorite parts of English paper piecing when you have to deal with these seam allowances. But when you know how to deal with them and how to work with them, it can relieve some of that tension and some of that stress that you might be feeling. So don't hesitate to just fold them and move them however you need to move them. No matter whether you are stitching from one end and going through the center to the other end, or whether you're starting in the center and going out in either direction, you want to be able to get these guys out of your way. You want to be able to see what you're doing. And so I just kind of fold them in whichever direction I can get them to go so that they're out of my way. And you don't need to worry about messing up this lovely spiral that we made. Once everything's stitched together, you can go back and with an iron or just finger pressing, you can make sure that you get your seam allowances back in the direction that you want them so that your block is nice and flat and you don't have a whole lot of, thickness in that area. But while you're stitching, you want to get these things going in whichever direction is going to be helpful for you. What it's doing now by just me folding it out of the way is I can actually see the centers where my fabrics are coming together. Which brings me to tip number 9 for creating points that match up is we need to actually stitch the points together. Now, this may seem obvious and like, well, yeah, duh, we want to stitch our points together. But sometimes, and it can be just because this process is not so enjoyable, sometimes we may be tempted to start at one end and stitch all the way across and not really think about what's going on right here at the center of our work. And we might skip right over that and maybe not even think about it. We may just be focusing on getting to this point here and then moving across to where the pieces join together again here, trying to kind of avoid all of this area where we have all this fabric going on. And believe me, I've done that myself. But what I have found in the past is it ends up leaving me with a gap in the middle of my blocks. If you have experienced this, then you know what I'm talking about. And it can be quite frustrating when you've spent the time and the effort putting together your motifs and you end up with a gap in the center. So the way to avoid that is to actually pause when you get to the center, whether you're starting at the center or you're starting at one end and you're coming to the center. You want to, with your seam allowances out of the way, you want to take your needle and you want to get into this area here and pick up some of that fabric. So I'm going to show you how I do that right now. I'm going to go ahead and start in the center. And what I want to do is fold these seam allowances out of the way. I've got some fabric already here. I've got a nice clearing here, but I want to find a clearing on the other side because I want to locate and then pick up the corresponding fabric that is on the other side of this seam. So I'm just folding these seam allowances out of my way. This one actually needs to be folded back, just like so that I can actually see the fabric that I want to pick up. And I'm just going to, just like I would take a normal stitch, I'm only picking up a little bit of fabric, but I want to make sure that I'm actually picking up those fabrics that are right in the center there. So there we go. We have a little bit of fabric from each of the sides that correspond and match up with each other. So I'm going to make sure that my thread tail is under my thumb as I pull. I'm going to take a couple more stitches in that same exact spot. Again, I'm only picking up a tiny bit of fabric. Hopefully you can see that as I hold these seam allowances out of the way. I'm picking up the very tip of the point from this piece here, and I'm picking up the very tip of the point of fabric from this piece here. And the only way to do that is by folding those seam allowances out of your way and really just not being afraid to be a little rough with them if you need to be. You know, if you need to just get them out of your way, don't be afraid to do that. Okay, so that's 3 stitches. I'm pulling a little bit harder on those stitches, and that is closing up that gap. I'm going to take one more stitch and I'm going to put a knot in that stitch. So that is secured. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take these off just for demonstration purposes. I want to show you. By taking those initial stitches, my pieces are already lined up. And by starting in the center and taking those initial stitches, I don't have to worry about things shifting as much anymore now. I need to do a couple more stitches in the next fabrics over. So again, I am going to just move these seam allowances out of the way. I need to locate the fabric that I want to actually stitch into. In this case, it's going to be this gingham fabric on the back side, and I need to open this up so that I can get to the turquoise fabric on this side. And I am working my whip stitch like this. So I'm going to start on the right hand side. Make sure that tail doesn't get caught there. And if you want, just focus on the one fabric at a time. So I picked up the gingham. I'm going to go ahead and pull my needle through. I'm not going to try to do both at once. I'm going to pull my needle through that fabric, and then I'm going to hop over to the next fabric, which is the turquoise, and I'm going to pick up fabric from the point of that shape right there. Now that I have that first stitch in, picking up both of those fabrics, I can repeat the process. So now I have both these 2 triangles joined and these 2 triangles joined together. And you can see they line up pretty well. That seam that goes through these 2 triangles is lined up right with this seam that goes through these 2 triangles. So that is how you would go about stitching between the tails where they're all coming together here in the center. So I'll meet you back at the table and we can chat about the final bonus tip that I wanted to share with you today. We'll get to the final bonus tip in just a moment, but before we do, I wanted to take a few seconds and tell you a little bit about the online community that I have created for quilters who want to learn the art of English paper piecing without frustration or overwhelm. It's called Blossom, and it's a step-by-step path to stitch bliss. Every month, members receive templates, patterns, skill-building workshops, resources, and inspiration inside of our amazing community where you can have your questions answered, get feedback on your work, and make new friends. If Blossom sounds like something you'd like to be a part of, be sure to check out the link that I have for you in the description to learn more. And now for our final bonus tip. And this one I think is probably the most important tip that I could give you today. Don't be so hard on yourself. These words reverberate for me over and over and over. They were words that my mom told me years ago and continually told me as I continue to grow up. And it's something that I constantly need to be reminded of. We need to not be so hard on ourselves if we don't achieve absolute perfection. English paper piecing is handwork after all, and handwork is by nature naturally imperfect because we as humans are imperfect. The imperfections that show up in our work prove that it was handmade. And I think that it actually adds value to whatever it is that we make. If everything we make was absolutely perfect, as though a machine made it, then it would no longer have that handmade, handcrafted feeling or look to it. And to me, that just sounds boring. So yes, we do want to try to match up our center points as best as we can. But any imperfections that we might see in our work is just there to remind us just how special our handmade items are. And so I want to encourage you to don't be hard on yourself. If you put in the time and the effort and you work really hard on something and it doesn't turn out exactly how you imagined or how you wanted it to, just learn from that experience and build your skills, keep practicing, and you'll get better next time. The more you practice, the better you will get. So don't be discouraged. Don't be hard on yourself. Just keep trying and keep enjoying your stitching. I hope this video was helpful for you. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the tips that I shared. Was there any one tip that really stood out to you that you're going to maybe try for your next EPP project? I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching this video, and remember to subscribe for more tips like these. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, happy stitching.